We decided to go camping that night, deep in nature, a few hours outside the city. It was supposed to be the perfect escaper, peaceful retreat to disconnect from everything. This particular spot was usually calm and tranquil, nestled away from the noise of the city. But deep down, I think we all knew that it wasn't the kind of place you'd want to be alone in at night. Yet, as a close-knit group, we felt safe. And I think we all believed that being together would make it all feel a little less eerie. So, we set out with high spirits, ready to spend the night under the stars. We arrived as the evening began to fade into night, the sky turning dark, with only the occasional sound of a bird or animal in the distance. We quickly set up our tents and gathered around the fire, laughing and talking as the flames flickered, casting an orange glow on our faces. The warmth of the fire felt good against the cool night air. As the evening passed, the conversation became more relaxed, but something felt off to me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt like the forest around us was different. The air grew colder as the night deepened, and the stillness of the place seemed to stretch on. The trees above us rustled faintly in the wind, but there was something else. It wasn't just the wind. It was as if the forest itself was alive, stirring with something I couldn't see or understand. From deep within the forest, I thought I heard something, almost like a faint hum, like a whisper that didn't belong to the trees or the wind. None of my friends seemed to notice, or maybe they didn't feel what I did, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. My skin prickled with unease, but I tried to push it aside. We were just having fun, talking and laughing, and I didn't want to ruin the mood. But even as everyone chatted, my eyes kept drifting to the shadows around us. The firelight flickered and danced, and with every flicker, I felt like I saw something in the dark. Then I saw him. There, standing just at the edge of the forest, was a figure. It was hard to make out details in the darkness, but I could tell there was someone or something there. My eyes couldn't focus enough to make out his face, but the shape was unmistakable. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. His posture, his body shape, everything about him felt oddly familiar, yet unsettling. He stood motionless, just outside the light of the fire, hidden in the dark of the trees. I looked at him for what felt like a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But the more I stared, the more I felt like the man was a shadow, like he didn't truly belong there. I kept my eyes on him, not sure whether I should speak up or just ignore it. But when I tried to ask my friends if they saw him, my voice seemed swallowed up by the sounds around us. No one noticed. I looked back at the figure, and even though I couldn't clearly see his face, I could feel his gaze. It was as if his eyes were locked onto me, but they were empty. There was nothing there, no emotion, no thought behind them, just an endless void staring back at me. It was like I was staring into the abyss itself, and the abyss was staring right back at me. I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, but my mind raced. What was he doing there? Why hadn't anyone else seen him? But before I could think about it more, I quickly turned back to my friends, trying to push the thought away. I didn't want to sound crazy, and I didn't want to make anyone worry. But even as I tried to join the conversation, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Time passed, and the firelight grew dimmer. As the night grew colder, a sense of heaviness filled the air. The darkness seemed to close in around us. Some of my friends began retreating to their tents, perhaps feeling the chill of the night creeping into their bones, but I stayed close to the fire. My body was telling me to leave, but something kept me there. It was as if an invisible force was holding me in place, keeping me tied to that spot. Then it happened. A scream, loud and desperate, echoed through the trees. The sound made my blood run cold. It was a scream for help, deep and raw, like someone was in pain. It was so terrifying that the echo of it still lingered in my ears long after it had faded. I froze, looking around, but none of my friends reacted. Sam, Alice, and Mark quickly retreated to their tents, and I was left sitting by the fire, alone in my panic. The scream seemed to come from far away, but the more I listened, the more it sounded like it was getting closer. I wanted to run, to follow the sound, but my body felt like it was weighed down. It was as if the air had thickened, making every movement feel like I was wading through water. I looked around, but there was only darkness. The world around me had suddenly become so quiet that I could hear the pounding of my heart in my ears. And just like that, everything went still. I looked toward the tents by the riverbank, and that's when I saw it. The light of our tent had gone out. I stood up and hurried toward it, my legs shaking, my heart hammering in my chest. As I got closer, I realized that something was very wrong. The tent was abandoned. There was no one around. Only an overwhelming silence filled the air, a silence that swallowed up every sound. Then, just as I was about to turn and run, I saw the figure again. The man, he was standing right in front of me, so close that I almost stumbled into him. His familiar silhouette loomed in the darkness, but now, his eyes, those empty eyes, were locked onto me once again. I tried to step back, my mind screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. His presence felt like it was pulling me in, like I was sinking into the emptiness of those eyes. My breath caught in my throat as I realized something. My friends were gone, and this man, this shadow, was still here. I tried to back away, but I was frozen in place, rooted to the ground by fear. The man didn't speak, didn't move. He just stared at me, and with every step he took toward me, the fear inside me deepened. The night dragged on, but as the first light of morning crept over the horizon, I realized something. I was alone. My friends were gone. The camp was abandoned, and the man, whoever or whatever he was still with me. By the river, I saw only his shadow. But now, the shadow was all that remained of him, and I couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, I would never escape the darkness he left behind. We had set out with excitement, the promise of adventure hanging in the air as we ventured deeper into the forest to spend the night. It was one of the most remote parts of the woods, a place most people would never think to camp. But for us, that was exactly why we wanted to be there. We craved the isolation, the chance to disconnect from the world and focus on each other for a night away from everything. The trees towered over us, the quiet so deep it felt almost unnatural. We laughed and joked as we set up our camp, but little did we know, by the end of that night, none of us would ever be the same. As night settled in, we began to fall asleep, one by one. The fire had burned down to almost nothing, but none of us noticed, too caught up in conversations that had lasted for hours. We hadn't been paying attention to the world around us, wrapped up in the comfort of each other's presence. It felt like the perfect night, peaceful and serene, until the morning came. When I stepped out of my tent to greet the new day, the first thing I noticed was the tracks. They were unlike anything I had seen before. At first, I thought they were just ordinary footprints, but something felt off. These tracks were strange, faint, yet distinct, and they seemed to barely lift from the ground, as though something had been dragged across the grass. They stretched across the campsite, leading in a direction that seemed to go on forever. My heart sank as I realized these weren't just random prints. They told a story of someone who had come and gone in the dead of night. I wasn't the only one who noticed. As the others woke up, we all circled around the tracks, inspecting them closely. There was a sense of unease hanging in the air, a collective realization that something wasn't right. The tracks surrounded us, yet there was no sign of anyone or anything that could have left them. No creature, no person, just these faint, chilling marks across the earth. The questions began to form in my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Who or what had made these tracks during the night, and why was there nothing else? It didn't take long for the silence to start creeping in. It wasn't just the usual quiet of the woods. This was something else. It felt as though the world had paused, waiting, watching. After a few hours of nervously examining the tracks, one of my friends got up to follow them. I could see the fear building in their eyes, but they walked off into the forest anyway, driven by something I couldn't quite understand. The rest of us stayed behind, uneasy hearts racing as we waited for anything to happen. But there was no sound, no rustling in the trees, no birds chirping, no breeze sweeping through the leaves, just a heavy, unnatural silence. And that silence felt like it was growing louder with every passing minute. Then, someone noticed something. One of our friends was missing. There had been no sounds, no screams, no calls for help, just the unsettling absence of noise. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. We scrambled to search the area, but the tracks, those haunting marks in the ground, had disappeared. It was as though they had never existed. Our friend was gone. No trace of them remained. In that moment, fear sank into our bones like ice. Everything about the night had shifted. It was as if we had been pulled into a nightmare that we couldn't wake up from. We searched desperately, calling out, but there was nothing. The only thing that remained was the silence, deep, unyielding silence, and the sense that something was watching us, something we couldn't see. The minutes stretched on, feeling like hours, as we desperately tried to make sense of what was happening. But the forest was still, unnaturally still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for us to make the next move. My eyes kept drifting toward the empty tent, the one where our friend had been. I don't know why, but I couldn't look away. I felt this strange pull, a combination of dread and curiosity. It was like something in that tent was calling me, but at the same time, I couldn't bring myself to go closer. It felt wrong, like the closer I got, the more I might disappear to. Then I saw it. A track, different from the others. It was like the others had been washed away, but this one remained. It led right to the front of the tent, and then stopped. It was as if something had turned around, right there, and then disappeared. The realization hit me hard. Our friend was gone, and they hadn't just wandered off. They had been taken. And now, their absence was all that remained. As the night dragged on, the silence seemed to grow thicker, suffocating us with its weight. Every rustle in the trees, every gust of wind felt ominous. We had no choice but to leave. The fear was too much to bear, and the eerie, unnatural quiet of the forest seemed to push us away. But even as we packed up and left, there was one thing we couldn't shake: the sounds of our campsite, echoing deep into the woods, as if they were calling us back. And though we vowed never to return to that forest again, a part of me will always wonder what we left behind in those woods, and whether those sounds would ever follow us. I've always been drawn to the idea of camping alone, getting away from the chaos of the city and immersing myself in nature. There's something peaceful about being alone in the forest, where the only sound you hear is your own voice, the rustling of the leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig. It was this sense of tranquility that led me to the forest I had long been curious about, a place I'd wanted to visit for years. So, one weekend, I decided to take the plunge. I packed my gear, headed into the depths of the forest, and set up camp in the darkness of the night, hoping for some peaceful solitude. The forest was beautiful quiet, almost too quiet. Once I had my tent up and my campfire going, I sat back and let the stillness of the place sink in. The crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze were the only sounds that filled the air. I took my time, watching the flames dance and flicker, and for a while, everything felt perfect. But as the night deepened, something began to shift. The quiet wasn't the same. It started to feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but there was a change in the air, as if the forest itself was stirring, watching. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination. I was alone, after all. The forest is full of life, and animals tend to make noises in the night. But as time passed, the sounds grew closer, more deliberate. The snap of a branch here, the rustling of leaves, their reach sound drawing nearer. My heart started to race. I told myself it was just an animal. It's nothing, I whispered to myself, trying to calm the growing unease. But the sounds didn't stop. They were closer now, almost as if something was moving around the campfire, circling me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I forced myself to stay still, my eyes locked on the fire. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. These weren't the sounds of animals. There was something else, something far more deliberate in the way the sound shifted and moved. It felt like I was being watched, as if someone or something was out there, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. And then, just as I was about to break down and run, I saw it. A silhouette. At first, it was just a dark shape against the trees, barely visible in the shadows. But as it took a step forward, I realized it wasn't just a shadow, it was a figure, a person. My body went rigid, my breath catching in my throat. Was it a person? Was it real? I couldn't tell, but I couldn't look away either. My heart was pounding now, my eyes desperately trying to make sense of what was happening. The figure took another step, and with it, my fear intensified. I stood up abruptly, my legs shaking beneath me as I scanned the surroundings. The figure was getting closer, and I could hear its movements, now slow, deliberate steps through the brush. I couldn't understand what was happening. Was someone lost in the woods? Or was this something else entirely? Then, from the darkness, came a voice. A whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "This is our place. You must leave." The words hung in the air like an eerie command, sending a chill down my spine. I froze, my eyes locked on the silhouette, now standing just at the edge of the firelight. The voice grew clearer, and the figure stepped closer, still moving like a shadow. There was something so wrong about it, something so unnatural. It wasn't just a person. Whatever it wasn't human. The air around me grew cold, the warmth of the fire no longer enough to shield me from the creeping dread. The whisper echoed again, this time more insistent. "Leave." I tried to move, tried to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The figure's presence was overpowering, its shape-shifting in ways I couldn't explain. The darkness around it thickened, like it was swallowing the light of the fire. My mind raced, my pulse pounding in my ears, but all I could do was stand there, paralyzed. Then, more shapes began to emerge from the forest. Silhouettes, one after the other, slowly encircling me. Each one moved with the same unnatural grace, their faces shapeless, their eyes dark and hollow. They weren't like any people I had ever seen, their forms twisted and wrong in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The air around me was thick with fear, and I could feel it suffocating me, choking the breath from my lungs. One of the figures spoke, its voice deep and commanding. "This is our place." The words were like a final sentence, sealing my fate in that moment. I backed away slowly, but they continued to close in. Every step I took, they matched. I was surrounded. The world felt like it was crumbling around me, the firelight flickering as if it were fighting to hold on to whatever was left of reality. Then, a voice louder, more forceful this time, shouted, "Leave." And just like that, the figures vanished. The forest fell back into an eerie silence, the kind of silence that presses down on you like a weight you can't escape. The whisper lingered, though, still echoing in my mind, vibrating in the very air around me. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I spent the rest of the night in that paralyzing fear, staring at the empty forest, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. By morning, the camp was untouched. No sign of the figures, no trace of what had happened. Just an empty forest, the whisper still ringing in my ears. As I packed up to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been marked, that I had trespassed somewhere I wasn't meant to be. I turned back for one last look at the forest, and as I did, I swore to myself I would never return. This place wasn't mine to visit. It belonged to something else, and I would never be foolish enough to go back.